"You can't do this to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking like thin ice over a deep, dark lake. "I am this community." I just stood there, hands loosely in my pockets, and watched the final, beautiful collapse. It was like watching a demolition I had planned myself, every charge going off in perfect sequence. The dust was still settling, but the outcome was never in doubt. For the first time in a long time, the air in our little slice of suburbia felt clean. It all started 6 months earlier, with the search for peace. My wife, Clara, had passed away the year before. Our house, the one we'd built together over 30 years of marriage, suddenly felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that was no longer mine. Every room held a ghost. Every object whispered a memory. I needed a fresh start, a place where the silence wouldn't be so deafening. I was a retired police detective, but retirement wasn't a good fit for me. I'd seen too much to just sit on a porch and watch the world go by. So, I'd turned my lifelong passion and professional expertise into a second career. I was a certified firearms instructor, specializing in advanced tactical training for law enforcement. I had contracts with several local and state departments, including the very police force that patrolled the town I was about to move into. It was good work. It kept my mind sharp and my skills honed. The house I found was perfect. It was a modest ranch-style home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was part of a planned community called Willow Creek Estates, which sounded pleasant enough. The key feature, the one that sealed the deal, was the property. It backed onto a thick, undeveloped parcel of woodland owned by the state. The lot was over an acre, and the backyard was deep, secluded, and sloped down into a natural earthen berm. It was a firearms instructor's dream. Before I even closed on the house, I did my due diligence. I spent weeks with city planners, zoning officials, and legal experts. I designed and submitted plans for a private, professional-grade shooting range in my backyard. It was a masterpiece of safety engineering. I had a 20-foot-high acoustic barrier constructed from sound-absorbing materials, reinforced with a solid concrete backstop. The side berms were angled to contain any possible ricochet. The entire setup exceeded every state and federal safety regulation. It was quieter than a standard lawnmower from 50 yards away and safer than a public swimming pool. I received every permit, every stamp of approval. Legally, my range was as solid as the concrete it was built from. I moved in on a sunny Tuesday in May, ready for my new, quiet life. The neighbors seemed nice enough. They'd give a friendly wave as I hauled boxes from the moving truck. The lawns were all perfectly manicured, the flower beds were pristine. It looked like a postcard for the American dream. I should have known that postcards only show one side of the story. I spent the first few weeks settling in, setting up my workshop, and putting the finishing touches on the range. I wanted to be a good neighbor, so I only practiced during reasonable hours, typically between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. on weekdays. The sound was minimal, a series of soft, contained pops. More of a dull thud than a sharp crack. It was the sound of a professional at work. That's when I met Brenda Blackwood. She came rolling up my driveway one Thursday morning in a golf cart that had HOA President emblazoned on the side in gaudy gold lettering. She was a woman in her mid-50s with a helmet of lacquered blonde hair and a face that looked permanently pinched, as if she'd just sniffed something unpleasant. I was cleaning one of my service pistols on my porch, enjoying the morning air. I saw her coming and gave a polite nod. "Can I help you?" I asked. She killed the engine on her electric chariot and stood with one hand on her hip, surveying my property with a look of profound disapproval. Her eyes scanned my perfectly compliant lawn, my freshly painted trim, and finally landed on the pistol in my hands. Her lips tightened into a thin, white line. "You must be the new owner," she said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "I am," I replied, setting the cleaning cloth aside. "Mark Ryder." "Nice to meet you." I didn't offer my hand. "Brenda Blackwood." "I'm the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association," she said, president with the kind of gravity usually reserved for heads of state. "I've received a complaint." I raised an eyebrow. "A complaint? I've only been here 3 weeks." "A noise complaint," she specified, her gaze flicking toward my backyard. "About the sounds. The popping." I knew exactly what this was about. I'd been expecting it, in a way. I had all my paperwork ready in a file just inside the door. "Ah, you mean my target practice," I said calmly. "Yes, that would be me. I'm a professional firearms instructor. I train the local police department." As a matter of fact, I offered a small, disarming smile. It didn't work. "This is a residential community, Mr. Ryder," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We have rules here. We value our peace and quiet. We don't allow disturbances." "I assure you, it's perfectly legal and safe," I explained patiently. "I have all the necessary permits from the city and state. The range is professionally designed to minimize noise and maximize safety. It's my business." She scoffed, a short, sharp sound like a startled bird. "Your business is not the concern of this HOA. The bylaws clearly state that any activity which constitutes a nuisance is strictly prohibited. And that, popping, is a nuisance." I could see this wasn't a conversation, it was a decree. She had already made up her mind. Reason wasn't going to be a part of this equation. "Well, Brenda," I said, my tone still even. "I'm sorry you feel that way. But as I said, I'm fully compliant with all city and state laws. My property, my right." Her eyes narrowed into slits. "The HOA bylaws supersede city ordinances within this community. You signed the agreement when you bought the house. You will cease this activity immediately." "No," I said, simply and without heat. "I won't." The look on her face was a mixture of shock and fury. It was clear she wasn't used to people telling her no. She looked like a computer that had just received an impossible command. "You will receive a formal violation notice," she hissed, her face turning a blotchy red. $100. And it will be $100 for every single day you continue to defy the rules." She spun on her heel, climbed back into her little throne of a golf cart, and sped away, leaving a trail of righteous indignation in her wake. I sighed and picked up my pistol again. I had come here for peace. But it seemed I had moved into the demilitarized zone of a petty war I didn't know existed. And I had just met the supreme commander of the opposing army. The next day, a crisp white envelope was taped to my front door. Inside was the violation notice, just as she'd promised. Code 14B, nuisance activity, repetitive loud noises, a $100 fine. I read it, chuckled, and filed it away in a new folder I labeled Brenda. I had a feeling it was going to get thick. I went out to my range that afternoon and fired exactly 50 rounds, slow and deliberate. It was my way of sending a message. I was not going to be bullied. The next day, another envelope. Another $100. This went on for a week. Every day, I practiced. Every day, a new fine appeared on my door. I was just stacking them up. I had no intention of paying a single dime for a violation that had no legal standing. The HOA bylaws were vague on the definition of a nuisance, and state law protecting licensed and permitted firearm ranges was crystal clear. Her fines were toilet paper. But Brenda wasn't one to be ignored. When her paper-based assault failed, she escalated. She moved to Phase 2, public shaming. The official Willow Creek Estates HOA Facebook group, which I had yet to join, apparently lit up with posts about the new, dangerous neighbor. I only found out because one of my neighbors, a quiet man named George who lived across the street, stopped me while I was getting my mail. "Hey, Mark," he said, looking around nervously as if spies were lurking in the azalea bushes. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. Brenda's really stirring the pot about you online." "Oh," I said, feigning mild interest. "Yeah. She's posting about gunshots at all hours. Calling you uncooperative and dangerous. Saying you're a threat to the children." He shook his head. "It's getting ugly. Most of us don't mind the noise, it's really not that loud. But people are scared of her." "I appreciate you telling me, George," I said. "Don't worry about it. I can handle Brenda." He nodded and scurried back into his house, a man clearly terrified of being seen talking to the local pariah. So, she was painting me as a monster. A classic tactic of the petty tyrant. Isolate the target, turn the community against them. It was straight out of a dictator's handbook, just on a much, much smaller scale. Then came the false police calls. That was the next step up her ladder of lunacy. The first time it happened, I was in my workshop. 2 patrol cars pulled into my driveway, lights off. A young officer I recognized from one of my training courses, Officer Miller, got out, looking apologetic. "Mark," he said, walking up to me. "Sorry to bother you. We got a call." "Let me guess," I said, wiping grease from my hands. "Anonymous tip about a man firing a weapon indiscriminately in his backyard." Miller winced. "Something like that. Shots fired, possibly automatic weapon. We knew it was probably you, but we have to respond." "Of course, you do," I said, nodding. "Come on back. I'll show you the setup." I gave him and his partner the full tour. They were impressed. They were cops, they understood safety protocols. They saw the permits, the construction, the clear lines of fire. They knew it was a textbook perfect range. "This is safer than the department's range," Miller's partner commented, whistling in appreciation. "Thanks," I said. "Feel free to tell your dispatcher this is a non-issue. The caller is the HOA president, Brenda Blackwood. She has a personal issue with me." Miller nodded. "We figured. She calls us about once a week for something. Someone's sprinklers hitting the sidewalk, a car parked 2 inches too close to the curb. We know the type." They left, and I thought that might be the end of it. But it wasn't. Brenda called them 3 more times that month. Each time, the officers would show up, give me a weary wave, mark the call as unfounded, and leave. It was a waste of their time and taxpayer money, but she didn't care. It was all part of her campaign of harassment. The fines kept coming, too. My Brenda folder was now a binder. She started getting creative. I got a fine for my grass being 3 inches high in one spot near a tree root. The limit was 25 inches. I got a fine because my garbage can was visible from the street for 2 hours after the trash had been collected. I got a fine because a small patch of paint was peeling on the corner of my window trim, a spot you could only see if you were standing on my flower bed with binoculars. Each fine was a declaration of war. Each one was her telling me that she owned this neighborhood, and I was just living in it on her sufferance. I remained calm. I documented everything. I took photos of the alleged violations. I saved every letter. I wrote down the dates and times of the police visits. I was building a case, just like in the old days. Every piece of evidence was another brick in the wall I was constructing around her. She thought she was besieging me, but she was the one who was about to be trapped. The turning point, the moment my patient defense turned into a cold, calculated plan for offense, came on a Saturday afternoon. It was the day she crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. It was the day she threatened my livelihood and my very identity. I had just finished a private training session with a detective from a neighboring county. He was a good man, trying to improve his skills. As he was leaving, Brenda's golf cart came screeching to a halt at the end of my driveway, blocking his car. She stormed over, her face a mask of incandescent rage. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, not at me, but at the detective. "Are you one of his gun nuts?" The detective, a big man named Peterson, looked at me, bewildered. I gave a slight shake of my head. "Ma'am, I'm just leaving," he said politely. "I saw you," she spat. "I saw you back there with him. With the guns. This is a peaceful community. We don't want your kind here." "Brenda, that's enough," I said, my voice low and steady. "This man is a police officer. You're interfering with him." That just added fuel to her fire. "Police? I don't believe you. You're probably part of some militia. I've read all about you people." She then turned her venom on me. "I warned you, Ryder. I told you to stop. You think you're so smart with your little range. But you're not just a nuisance. You're unstable. You're a danger." My blood ran cold. I knew where this was going. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it," she snarled. "I'm going to make sure the state knows what a menace you are. They have ways of dealing with people like you. Red flags. They can take your precious guns away. And when they do, your little business will be over." She had said it. She had threatened to file a false extreme risk protection order. She was threatening to use a tool designed to save lives from legitimate threats as a weapon in a petty neighborhood squabble. She was willing to lie under oath and potentially ruin my life, my reputation, and my ability to make a living, all because she didn't like the sound of my target practice. Detective Peterson stared at her, his professional calm cracking. "Ma'am, what you just said is a serious crime. Filing a false police report, especially a red flag report, is a felony." Brenda just laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "He'll never prove it. It'll be my word against his. And I'm a respected community leader. He's just some trigger-happy maniac. Who do you think they'll believe?" She finally got back in her cart and sped off, cackling to herself. I stood there in the driveway, the silence she left behind buzzing in the air like static. Peterson looked at me, his face grim. "Mark, you need to do something about her," he said. "She's not just a Karen. She's dangerous." "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "And I will." That was the moment the game changed. She had pushed me too far. She had mistaken my patience for weakness. She had mistaken my calm for surrender. She had just declared total war, and she had no idea who she was fighting. The peace-seeking man who had moved into Willow Creek was gone. In his place was the detective I used to be. Methodical. Relentless. And now, deeply motivated. Brenda Blackwood had just started digging her own grave. My job was to hand her a bigger shovel. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my office, a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk, and I began to plan. This was no longer about defending my rights, it was about dismantling hers. She had used her power to terrorize and control. I would use my skills to bring her to justice. My first call was to my old partner, Dave. He'd retired a few years before me and was now running a successful private investigation firm. "Dave," I said when he picked up. "I need a favor." I laid out the whole story. He listened patiently, punctuating my tale with grunts of disgust. When I got to the part about the red flag threat, he exploded. "That witch," he roared. "That's it. We're burying her, Mark. What do you need?" "Everything," I said. "I want a complete workup on Brenda Blackwood. Financials, connections, history. I want to know where she gets her coffee in the morning and what brand of toilet paper she uses. I also want you to look into the HOA's finances. Something's not right there." "Consider it done," Dave said. "And Mark? Install cameras. High definition, night vision, the whole works. Cover every inch of your property line. If she's this unhinged, she's going to trespass." "Already on my list," I said. The next day, I had a professional security system installed. For discreet, high-resolution cameras that fed directly to a secure server in my office. They covered my front door, my driveway, and the entire perimeter of my backyard. Any movement would trigger a recording. Brenda Blackwood was now starring in her own reality show, and she didn't even know it. While Dave started digging on his end, I started my own investigation. I formally requested copies of the HOA's financial statements, meeting minutes, and governing documents for the past 5 years, which was my right as a homeowner. The response I got was a terse letter from Brenda, denying my request on the grounds that it was not made in good faith, and was intended to harass the board. It was an illegal denial, and it was the first big mistake she made. It told me she was hiding something. If she wouldn't give me the documents, I'd find them another way. I started talking to my neighbors. Not directly about Brenda, but just making conversation. I learned who had been in the neighborhood the longest, who had served on the board before, who had run-ins with her. It was slow work. People were afraid of her. But I planted seeds. I let them know I wasn't backing down. A few weeks later, Dave called. "I've got something," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "You were right to be suspicious of the finances. The books are a mess." He explained that for the past 3 years, since Brenda had become president, the HOA's landscaping budget had nearly tripled. The payments were all going to a company called Evergreen Lawn and Garden. "Sounds innocent enough," I said. "It's not," Dave replied. "I ran the company. It was incorporated 3 years ago. The owner is a man named Martin Gable. Ring a bell?" "No," I said. "He's Brenda Blackwood's brother-in-law." There it was. the smoking gun. It was classic small-time graft. She was funneling HOA dues, our money, into her family's pockets. The over-the-top landscaping, the constant resodding of the common areas, the gold-plated golf cart, it was all being paid for by her little embezzlement scheme. The problem is proving it, Dave said. The payments are all approved in the meeting minutes. On paper, it looks like the board approved these contracts. The board is just her and two of her cronies, I said. They rubber stamp whatever she wants. Exactly. To make this stick, you need to prove she's getting a direct kickback, or that the contract was awarded without a proper bidding process, in violation of the bylaws. I pulled out the copy of the bylaws I had. I'd read them cover to cover multiple times. I flipped to the section on contracts. Section 9, Paragraph C. All contracts over $5,000 must be open to a competitive bidding process with at least 3 quotes. There you go, Dave said. I guarantee you that never happened. But the minutes will say it did, I countered. She controls the records. Then you need an inside source, he said. Someone who was there. Someone she crossed. I thought back to my conversations with the neighbors. There was one name that had come up a couple of times. A Mrs. Gable. No relation to the landscaper, ironically. An elderly woman who had been on the HOA board for years until she was suddenly and acrimoniously pushed out right after Brenda took over. It was time to pay Mrs. Gable a visit. Finding the weakness was one thing. Now I had to formulate the plan. This wasn't just about exposing her fraud. That was too simple. It had to be poetic. She had used the rules, her rules, as a weapon against me. I would use the actual rules, the ones she ignored, to utterly dismantle her. My plan had multiple phases. I called it Operation Garden Gnome. Phase 1 was bait. I needed to make her overreact. I needed her to get so obsessed with me that she'd make mistakes, big ones, on camera. I went to the local garden supply store and bought 200 garden gnomes. Small ones, big ones, gnomes fishing, gnomes sleeping, gnomes pushing wheelbarrows. A whole ceramic army. I then consulted the HOA bylaws again. There was a specific, ridiculous rule about lawn ornaments. All lawn ornaments must be no more than 24 inches in height and must be placed at least 10 feet apart. That weekend, I went to work. With a tape measure and a set of survey flags, I began placing my gnome army in my front yard. Each one was exactly 23 inches tall. Each one was placed exactly 10 feet and 1 inch from its neighbor in a perfect grid. My entire front lawn was transformed into a bizarre, creepy, but perfectly compliant gnome paradise. The effect was immediate. The next morning, Brenda's golf cart was parked across the street before the sun was even fully up. She was just sitting there, staring. I could feel her rage from across the yard. It was a palpable thing, like heat rising off asphalt. She spent an hour out there, sometimes getting out of her cart to pace and gesticulate wildly to someone on her phone. My cameras were recording every glorious moment. Later that day, the first email arrived. Subject: Immediate action required, unapproved lawn infestation. The email was a masterpiece of barely controlled fury. She called my gnomes tacky, an eyesore, and, a deliberate mockery of this community's aesthetic standards, she demanded their immediate removal, citing a vague clause about maintaining neighborhood harmony. I replied with a short, polite email. Dear Brenda, thank you for your email. As per Section 12, Paragraph D of the bylaws, my lawn ornaments are in full compliance with the specified height and spacing requirements. Have a wonderful day. Sincerely, Mark Ryder. Her response came back in less than a minute. It was in all caps. This is not a joke, Ryder. You are making a mockery of the rules. Remove the gnomes or I will have them removed and bill you for the service. This is your final warning. Threatening to come onto my property and remove my belongings. Beautiful. I saved the email to a special folder. Phase 2 was setting the trap. I knew she couldn't resist. I knew her control freak nature would compel her to take matters into her own hands. That night, I waited. I sat in my office, watching the live feed from my security cameras. At 2:17 a.m., I saw movement. A shadowy figure was creeping across my lawn. It was Brenda. She was dressed in dark clothing, carrying a large trash bag. She started at the edge of the grid, snatching up my gnomes and stuffing them into the bag. She was so consumed by her mission, she never once looked up at the camera that was capturing her every move in crystal clear high definition. She managed to grab about a dozen gnomes before I hit the button. I had wired my sprinkler system to a remote switch. With a single click, every sprinkler head on my lawn erupted at once, dousing her in a torrent of cold water. She screamed, a satisfyingly shrill sound, dropped the bag of gnomes, and scrambled back to her golf cart, soaking wet and utterly defeated. The video was priceless. It was clear, well lit by my motion-activated security lights, and even captured her muttering curses as she fled. It was felony theft and trespassing, caught on tape. The next day, a notice was posted in the community clubhouse for an emergency HOA meeting. The topic, proposed bylaw amendment to prohibit all lawn ornaments and to address nuisance properties. She was trying to change the rules after the fact to retroactively justify her actions. It was time for the first reveal. The emergency meeting was held in the small, stuffy community center. About 30 residents showed up, most of them looking either bored or intimidated. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her two loyal board members, a pair of sour-faced sycophants named Doris and Earl. She called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a tirade. She didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She spoke of new elements that were disrupting the harmony of Willow Creek. She talked about blatant disregard for aesthetic standards and the need for the board to have more power to deal with problem residents. She then proposed her new bylaw, a complete ban on all lawn ornaments, effective immediately. And a second proposal that would give the HOA president the authority to declare a property a nuisance and levy unlimited fines without a full board vote. It was a blatant power grab. Even some of the more timid residents were starting to look uncomfortable. When she finished, she asked if there was any discussion. I stood up. I have a few questions, I said calmly. Brenda's eyes shot daggers at me. Mr. Ryder. I should have known you'd have something to say. I do, I said, walking to the front of the room. First, regarding the proposed bylaw amendment. According to our existing bylaws, any amendment requires a 30-day written notice to all homeowners and a 2/3 majority vote. This emergency meeting doesn't meet those legal requirements, does it? A murmur went through the crowd. I could see Brenda's face flush. She knew I was right. Earl, her crony, started flipping frantically through the binder of rules in front of him. It's a procedural matter, she snapped. We can vote to waive the notice period. No, you can't, I said. It's not a procedural matter. It's a legally binding covenant. Trying to ram this through tonight is illegal. Before she could respond, I continued. But I'm more interested in what prompted this sudden emergency. You mentioned disrupting harmony and mockery of the rules. I have a feeling you might be referring to my garden gnomes. Your ridiculous gnome army is an affront to this entire community, she sputtered. An affront that is, as I pointed out in my email, in perfect compliance with the current rules, I said. The rules you are now trying to illegally change because you don't like how I'm following them. You are twisting the rules, she shrieked. No, Brenda. I'm following them. Which brings me to my next point. I pulled a small tablet from my jacket pocket. Last night, several of my lawn ornaments, my private property, were stolen. I was worried, so I checked my security camera footage. And I found something very interesting. I'd like to show you all. I connected my tablet to the small projector that was set up for Brenda's presentation. And I played the video. The room was dead silent. All they could hear was the sound of the sprinklers and Brenda's distant, watery cursing. The video showed her, clear as day, on my property in the middle of the night, stuffing my gnomes into a bag. When the video ended, I turned to face the room. Brenda was frozen, her face a ghastly shade of white. The other residents were staring at her, their mouths agape. So, Brenda, I said, my voice soft but carrying through the silent room. It seems the real, problem resident isn't the one following the rules, but the one who breaks the law when she doesn't get her way. Trespassing, theft. I believe the police would be very interested in this. She finally snapped out of her stupor. That's fake. It's doctored. He's trying to frame me. But no one was buying it. The evidence was right there. They had seen it with their own eyes. She had lost the room completely. Her credibility had shattered like cheap glass. "This meeting is adjourned," she screeched, banging her gavel so hard its wooden head flew off and skittered across the floor. She grabbed her things and practically ran out of the room, Doris and Earl trailing behind her like pilot fish. I had won the battle. But I knew the war was far from over. I had publicly humiliated her. A woman like Brenda Blackwood would not let that stand. She was cornered now, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Her retaliation would be vicious. I needed to be ready for it. Brenda's response was faster and more venomous than I could have imagined. Humiliated and exposed, she abandoned all pretense of using the HOA rules as her weapon. She decided to try and burn my life to the ground. Her smear campaign went into overdrive. The private HOA Facebook page became her personal burn book. I was no longer just a nuisance, I was a violent and unstable ex-cop, a paranoid recluse with an arsenal, a danger to the community. She twisted my career in law enforcement, suggesting I must have been fired for brutality. She invented stories about me threatening children who got too close to my yard. It was a torrent of libelous filth. But her most dangerous move was a direct attack on my livelihood. She found out which police departments I had training contracts with. And she started calling them. She called the chiefs, the city managers, anyone who would listen. She painted the same picture of me, a mentally unstable firearms instructor who was a liability to any department that employed him. I found out when I got a call from Chief Miller, the head of the local police department and an old friend. "Mark," he said, his voice weary. "We need to talk. I just spent an hour on the phone with a very passionate citizen named Brenda Blackwood." My stomach tightened. "Let me guess. I'm a ticking time bomb who shouldn't be allowed near law enforcement officers." "You're psychic," Miller grunted. "She demanded we terminate your training contract immediately. Said you were a lawsuit waiting to happen. She even mentioned something about filing a red flag petition against you." "She's been threatening that for a while," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, Mark, you and I go way back. I know this woman is full of hot air. My officers who responded to her bogus calls told me your range is safer than ours. I'm not going to terminate your contract. But the city manager is getting nervous. This kind of complaint, no matter how baseless, creates political headaches. You need to get this handled." "I am handling it, Chief," I said. "Believe me. I'm very close to a permanent solution." "Good," he said. "Because my patience with Mrs. Blackwood is wearing thin. The next time she calls 911 because your grass is too long, I'm going to consider charging her with misuse of emergency services." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling slightly with rage. She was trying to destroy my reputation, a reputation I had spent 30 years building. She was trying to take away the one thing I had left that gave me purpose. This was it. The gloves were off. It was time to end it. That evening, I decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Gable. She lived in a small, tidy house at the other end of the neighborhood. She was a frail-looking woman in her late 70s with sharp, intelligent eyes. I had heard she was a formidable presence on the board before Brenda's coup. I introduced myself at her door, and she invited me in, her expression cautious. "I know who you are, Mr. Ryder," she said as she poured me a cup of tea. "You're the man who stood up to the Dragon Lady." It was all over the neighborhood grapevine. "I'm just trying to be left in peace," I said. "But it seems that's not an option with Brenda in charge." Mrs. Gable sighed. "No, it isn't. That woman lives on conflict. She thrives on power. I served on that board for 15 years. We were volunteers, trying to keep the neighborhood nice. When she got elected, everything changed. It became her personal kingdom." "I heard you were on the board when she took over," I said, getting to the point. "I need to know what happened." Her eyes clouded over. "She bullied me out. Accused me of mismanaging funds, of all things. It was a lie, of course. It was because I started asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About the new landscaping contract," she said, her voice dropping. "Our old service was reliable and affordable. Suddenly, Brenda insisted we switch to this new company, Evergreen. Their bid was nearly double the old one. I wanted to see the other bids. She refused. She said it was handled. When I pushed, she and her new board members, Doris and Earl, held a private vote to remove me. It was a smear job. This was it. The final piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Gable, I said, leaning forward. Did you keep any of your old records from that time? Any emails, any documents? She looked at me, a flicker of fear in her eyes, quickly replaced by a steely resolve. That woman ruined my reputation in this community. I've lived here for 40 years. Yes, Mr. Ryder. I kept everything. She led me to a small study and pulled a box from the top of a closet. It was filled with files, printed emails, and financial statements. It was a perfect, preserved record of the time just before and during Brenda's takeover. It had the original landscaping bids she claimed not to have. It had emails where she threatened Mrs. Gable to back off. It had the financials showing the sudden, unjustifiable budget increase. It was the smoking gun, the murder weapon, and the signed confession all rolled into one. It was enough to prove not just a violation of bylaws, but criminal fraud and embezzlement. I spent 2 hours with Mrs. Gable, scanning every document onto a secure flash drive. When I left her house that night, I had everything I needed to destroy Brenda Blackwood. The next morning, I called my contact at the state's attorney's office, a man Dave had put me in touch with. I explained the situation and told him about the evidence I now possessed. He was intrigued. This goes beyond a simple HOA dispute, he said after I laid it all out. If what you have is legitimate, we're talking about multiple felonies. Embezzlement, fraud, witness tampering. I want to see that drive, Mr. Ryder. I met with 2 state investigators that afternoon in a sterile conference room downtown. I walked them through the timeline. The initial harassment. The illegal fines. The public libel. The false police reports. The attempted theft caught on video. And then, the grand finale, the meticulously documented financial crimes. I showed them the contracts, the emails from Mrs. Gable's files, the corporate records linking the landscaping company to Brenda's family. They listened in silence, their expressions growing grimmer with each piece of evidence I presented. When I was done, one of them, a tall, no-nonsense detective, looked at his partner. "It's a slam dunk," he said. The other investigator turned to me. "Mr. Ryder, we have more than enough here to get a warrant. But this woman sounds like a public figure in her little world. A public arrest can be messy. We prefer to do things cleanly." He paused. "Is there another HOA meeting coming up soon?" A slow smile spread across my face. "As a matter of fact, there is. The annual meeting is in 2 weeks. She'll be presiding over it like a queen." "Perfect," the detective said, a predatory gleam in his eye. "We'll let you set the stage. We'll be in the audience. When you've laid it all out for the community, we'll step in and take her into custody. A public takedown for a public tyrant. It seems appropriate. Poetic justice." It was more than I could have hoped for. The final showdown was set. The annual Homeowners Association meeting for Willow Creek Estates. It was normally a dull affair, attended by a handful of retirees with nothing better to do. This year, the community center was packed. Word had gotten out after the disastrous emergency meeting. Everyone knew there was a war brewing between the new guy at the end of the cul-de-sac and the iron-fisted HOA president. They had come for the fireworks. I arrived early and set up my laptop with the projector. Brenda was already there, holding court at the front of the room. She was dressed in a severe power suit, her helmet of hair seemingly sprayed with extra concrete for the occasion. When she saw me, she gave me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She thought this was her chance to crush me once and for all. She had no idea she was a dead woman walking. The meeting began with the usual drudgery. The reading of last year's minutes, the treasurer's report, which was a masterpiece of creative accounting, and reports from various committees that didn't do anything. Brenda ran through it all with brisk, arrogant efficiency. Then, she got to the main event. New business. "As many of you know," she began, her voice oozing false sincerity, "we have recently had some challenges in our community regarding the interpretation and, in some cases, the flagrant violation of our community standards, her eyes flicked to me. It has become clear that the current board needs stronger tools to maintain the peace and property values we all cherish. Therefore, I am reintroducing the proposals from our last meeting for a full community vote. She went on, reproposing her ban on lawn ornaments and her bill to give herself dictatorial powers. She framed it as a necessary step to protect the neighborhood from disruptive and potentially dangerous individuals. When she finished her speech, she smirked at me. "Is there any discussion before we vote?" "I have a presentation I'd like to make," I said, standing up and walking to the podium. "We don't have time for your theatrics, Ryder," she snapped. "Oh, I think you'll want to see this," I said, my voice calm and confident. I looked out at the assembled homeowners. "My name is Mark Ryder. Many of you only know me as the source of Brenda's recent agitation. I'd like to take a few minutes to show you the real reason she wants more power. It has nothing to do with gnomes, and everything to do with greed." I clicked the first slide on my presentation. It was a simple title, Willow Creek HOA, a 5-year review. I started slowly. I showed them the escalating fines levied against me, all for bogus violations. I showed them the side-by-side photos of my 3-inch grass and my peeling paint, and the crowd began to chuckle. Then, I played the unhinged, all-caps emails she had sent me. The chuckles turned into murmurs of disbelief. Next, I played the high-definition video of her trespassing on my property and stealing my gnomes. The room went silent. I could see people turning to look at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and disgust. Her face was turning a pale, sickly color. "This is what our HOA president does when she doesn't get her way," I said into the microphone. "She violates the law. But petty theft and trespassing, as it turns out, is the least of her crimes." Click. The next slide showed the HOA's landscaping budget for the past 5 years. It was a simple bar graph. For the first 2 years, it was stable. Then, the year Brenda became president, the bar on the graph shot up, tripling in size, and stayed there. I was curious about this sudden increase, I explained. So I did some research. Click. The next slide showed the corporate filing for Evergreen Lawn and Garden, and right there, listed as the sole proprietor, was the name, Martin Gable. Click. The next slide was a family photo I'd found on social media. It was Brenda, her husband, her sister, and her sister's husband, Martin Gable. "Our HOA president has been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of our dues into her brother-in-law's company for the past 3 years, I announced. The room erupted in gasps and angry shouts. "It's a lie!" Brenda screamed, finding her voice. "It was all approved. We had other bids. It was the best offer." "Was it?" I asked sweetly. Click. The next slide showed the 3 official bids for the landscaping contract from the year she took over. They were from Mrs. Gable's files. The bid from Evergreen was, by far, the highest. These are the documents our president didn't want the board to see. The ones she hid after forcing a good woman, Mrs. Gable, off the board for asking too many questions. I looked over at Mrs. Gable in the front row. She was crying softly, a look of pure vindication on her face. Brenda was on her feet now, completely unhinged. "This is slander. These are forged documents. You can't prove any of this." Her meltdown was spectacular. She was ranting, raving, incriminating herself with every word. "So what if I helped my family?" Martin was struggling. "Is it a crime to help your family? This is what you get for trying to make a community nice. Ungrateful people." As she was screeching, 2 men stood up from the back of the room. They were dressed in plain business suits, but they moved with an unmistakable air of authority. They were the state investigators. They walked calmly to the front of the room, flanking the podium where Brenda was having her public meltdown. "Brenda Blackwood," one of them said, his voice cutting through her tirade. She stopped, her mouth hanging open, and stared at them. "I'm Detective Harris, State Attorney's Office," he said, flashing his badge. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and witness tampering." The entire room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The only sound was the clicking of the handcuffs as the second detective secured Brenda's wrists behind her back. The color drained completely from her face. She looked like she had been turned to stone. Then, as they began to lead her away, her eyes found mine. The shock turned back into pure, venomous rage. "You'll regret this," she shrieked, her voice a raw, desperate howl that echoed in the silent room. "You can't do this to me. I am this community. I'll sue you for everything you have. You'll be ruined." It was her last, hollow threat. A final, impotent burst of noise before she was consumed by the consequences of her own actions. As the detectives led her out the door, the community she claimed to be erupted, not in applause, but in a collective, cathartic sigh of relief. The reign of terror was over. The aftermath was swift and cleansing. With Brenda gone, her cronies on the board resigned in disgrace. A new board was elected, with Mrs. Gable unanimously chosen as the new president. The first order of business was to terminate the contract with Evergreen Lawn and Garden and to hire back the old, affordable company. The ridiculous rules Brenda had instituted were systematically dismantled. The community began to heal. People started talking to each other again. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion lifted like a morning fog. Neighbors who had been afraid to even look at me were now stopping by to thank me, bringing cookies and pies as tokens of their gratitude. I became the quiet, reluctant hero of Willow Creek. Brenda's fate was exactly what she deserved. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had compiled, she took a plea deal. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison and was ordered to pay back every last cent she had embezzled from the HOA. The restitution bankrupted her and her husband. He divorced her while she was awaiting sentencing. She lost her house, her status, her freedom. She lost everything. It was a complete and total ruin, authored by her own arrogance. I finally got what I had moved here for, peace. The police department, far from canceling my contract, signed me on for another decade. Chief Miller called it my civic duty bonus. My backyard range was no longer a point of contention, it was a symbol of the quiet determination that had liberated the neighborhood. Sometimes, I'd go out there in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the trees. I'd set up a target and practice, the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of the shots echoing against the berm. It was no longer the sound of defiance. It was the sound of tranquility. The sound of a battle won and a peace well earned. And in my front yard, standing guard in their perfect, compliant grid, my army of 200 garden gnomes remained. They were a silent, ceramic monument to the simple truth that sometimes, the only way to deal with a bully is to stand your ground, know the rules better than they do, and never, ever be afraid to fight back. They thought they were untouchable, but in the end, they cracked just like anyone else.